Here on 16.4, we'll finish up chapter 16 and continue our supply side policies in the short run, what the short run options are, and we'll continue on with what we've been talking about. Now let's talk about deregulation. Deregulation is when, let's first of all talk about regulation. So government imposes regulations that directly affect employment and production decisions, so it affects the aggregate supply curve. Excessive regulations, they're costly to producers, so by definition they shift the aggregate supply curve to the left, which is a bad thing, right? So decreasing regulation, otherwise known as deregulation, can reduce costs for producers and shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. But now we have to try to figure out which regulations are excessive, right? Because some regulations can do some good. Let's go ahead on the left-hand side. We're talking about regulations may have some good reasons for existing, but of course they shift the aggregate supply curve to the left by increasing cost to the producers. So here's some examples, and you all can figure out for yourselves how good are these things. Things like the minimum wage. Is that a good thing? That's a difficult question. Clearly, for the worker who keeps their job under minimum wage, it's a good thing for them because they raise their incomes, but we now have the problem of triggering unemployment among workers whose skills do not justify an income higher than the minimum wage. So minimum wage laws cut both ways. There's a trade-off, as we've always talked about. Same thing with mandatory benefits, occupational health and safety laws. All of these things could be good at the right level, but also could be bad if they're so onerous that they do more damage than good. Supply-siders contend that regulatory costs are now too high, that the United States has gone from being a reasonable level of regulation to an excessive level of regulation. Let's talk about some of the regulation not in the factor market. It was on the left-hand side. That's the worker market. The product market, that's what businesses deal with as they try to build and sell things. So transportation costs, food and drug standards, environmental protection, those are all good things. But of course, they can be at an onerously high level. Let me give you a quick example of one. Let's make up a regulation. We don't actually do this, but let's make one up just so you can see what I'm referring to. I live in a condo building. In my condo building, it's required by law that every single unit in our condo has a full fire sprinkler system. So just like a commercial office building, our condo building has sprinklers in every single room and in every single closet. Now, is that a good thing? Is that an example of good regulation or an example of over-regulation? In a condo, since we all live so closely, a fire in one unit spreads quickly to the other units, it probably makes sense. So let's assume that government says, wow, look how great these sprinkler systems are for condos. Why don't we require them for every single home built in the United States? Will that be a good regulation? I hope you all start to realize, whoa, wait a minute now. To put a full sprinkler system in a house may cost up to $10,000. How much benefit will homeowners get? Because remember, homeowners already have smoke detectors. And when the smoke detector goes off, you leave your house. The house may burn down, but you don't affect anyone else's house because there's usually enough space between houses that when one house catches on fire, it doesn't automatically spread to the other houses. And there's certainly enough time for the fire department to show up and put out the fire from spreading to the other houses. Would that be a good regulation for the United States to require every homeowner have a $10,000 sprinkler system set up in their home? I would argue that no, it would be a bad thing. What would it do to the aggregate supply curve? It would shift it to the left because it would make houses more expensive and therefore reduce the ability of contractors to supply houses to homeowners. So that would be an example of over-regulation. And of course, we aren't doing that, but that's my point. Regulation, safety regulation is a good thing up to a point. You can get to the point where you're so over-regulating and spending so much money on satisfying the regulations that you're not really saving enough people to justify spending $10,000 per house. When there's 100 million houses in the United States, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars would be essentially wasted because it really wouldn't save anybody since they've already been saved by the $20 smoke detector has already saved everybody. There's no reason to spend $10,000 on the sprinkler system for houses. Whereas it makes perfect sense to do it for condos. So my point I want you all to recognize is some regulations make sense, and then some regulations overdo it and are costly and damage the ability of society to supply goods and services, which in the parlance or the language of economics means we're shifting the aggregate supply curve to the left, and we don't want to do that. Another thing we could do is ease trade barriers. Government regulations also influence international trade, which influences aggregate supply curve. So we know that tariffs are taxes on imported goods. They make costs higher compared to, for instance, U.S. production. So while many people think tariffs are a good thing, don't forget there's a trade-off involved. Tariffs also cause parts costs for American manufacturers to rise. Picture the problem of tariffs on steel. Tariffs on steel make imported steel prices more expensive. So when Caterpillar Tractor goes to build a new tractor, instead of buying the cheaper foreign steel, they have to pay more for the expensive American steel. That's good for American steel workers, but now the Caterpillar Tractor becomes more expensive, and when Caterpillar competes against Komatsu, which is a Japanese tractor maker, when they both compete against each other in Brazil, for instance, who now wins the contract? It's now Komatsu instead of Caterpillar, and Caterpillar has to lay workers off. So, supply-siders are generally against tariffs. They see it as doing more damage to the economy by shifting the aggregate supply curve to the left than we get in benefits. So they're generally against tariffs. And also supply-siders generally want immigration to be easier for workers in skill categories that are in shortages. Not necessarily immigration generally, but in areas, especially high-tech areas where we have a shortage of workers, they want to have more immigration of skilled workers in order to make the ability of the U.S. to be more productive increase. And then last but not least, our last slide on this particular chapter, on chapter 16, how do we deal with infrastructure? How important is infrastructure? Well, first of all, we have to remind ourselves what our infrastructure is. I know we've talked about this in the past, but infrastructure includes things like roads, bridges, ports, the big transmission power lines, those kinds of things. Every society needs those things for ordinary businesses to function, because obviously your factory cannot supply goods and services if there's no railroads and no roads. You have to have all that infrastructure for society to be productive. Now, if we let our infrastructure run down in quality because everything depreciates, highways do. Let's use an example of an interstate made of concrete. Over a 20-30 year period, the potholes start to develop and eventually the road becomes less usable, right? So we need to be constantly investing in our infrastructure to maintain the road system, not only as it is today, but also to build out even more roads, more lanes, whatever, as our population grows. We don't want bottlenecks developing in the interstate. I don't know about you, but I notice whenever I go down to Florida, you drive down 75 or Interstate 95, that road is choked with traffic. We clearly need to be doing more in order to open up the traffic. So my point here is supply-siders are worried about infrastructure, that we want to make sure that we are investing in infrastructure to make sure we don't have such a huge backlog of problems to deal with, that the costs of actually doing the construction work skyrocket, and simultaneously the amount of reduced productivity of both workers and businesses doesn't get too large. So whenever we have good investment in infrastructure that reduces costs, we shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, which is a good thing. And how can we do things like this? One thing is, of course, we can invest more in infrastructure and also reduce barriers even already existing within our society, things such as prevailing wage laws. Prevailing wage laws are essentially a reward to unions where the government says the government contract cannot be done by the low-cost bidder. It must be done by somebody who pays union wages. Now that all sounds really good until you realize what it does to the cost of building the highway. You realize that we get a whole lot fewer highways built when you have prevailing wage laws than you would if you gave it to non-union workers. So you could be done at a lower cost, and therefore we could get more miles of highway either repaired or built. And that would be good for society overall, because that now increases the productivity of all the members of society when we have a good road system as opposed to a worn out road system. Okay, that'll be the last slide on chapter 16.3, which is the last set of slides for chapter 16. We're moving on to the next chapter.